Well, hey everyone, Hudson here, and I'm taking a little break from my typical. I'm filming an approaching the scene video about Nikon Z9's firmware 3.0 and some of the cool new updates with it, because I've gotten a number of emails and comments with people concerned about changes in 3D tracking, which I do not think are a bug. I actually think they're an improvement. How that interacts, those changes interact with the hybrid handoff autofocusing technique that I and others have advocated for shooting sports and action and wildlife and fast-moving subjects. And I don't think there's any problem with that. I actually think it's improved, and I'll talk about that and show you some examples why. I've also heard from some people saying that they've had some issues with the My menu when they're upgrading to firmware 3.0, and I think that there are a few menus and settings in the camera that had name changes. I haven't had any effect with mine updating. I updated before I heard anything about that, and it was seamless. But if you want to be extra cautious, I would suggest before you upgrade to firmware 3.0, which I think you should, I think there's a lot of cool improvements, I think you should back up all your settings, and if you have any problem, restore those settings, delete all the My menu items, just make a list of what they are, and then update and reinstall them. I have heard from a few people that just had issues with grayed out options they couldn't get rid of. All right, so that aside, let's talk about 3D tracking and how it has changed with firmware 3.0. I think what I'm seeing with 3D tracking, if I initiate it as my only mode, it's on my back button, I'm shooting in 3D tracking mode. When it loses a subject, 3D tracking is, you point out a subject, it locks on that subject. It's particularly looking for eyes and faces of heads, torsos of people or animals, or looking for vehicles or any combination of those. If it's in the automatic subject detection mode, it looks for people first, then animals, then vehicles. And if it locks onto eyes, it's locked. If it locks onto a head, it's locked. If it can't see any such thing and you put it on some object, it'll try to lock that, but if it loses it, if it suddenly stops recognizing the subject, it's doing better at staying with the subject and tracking it. But the way that I think that they've done that is by having it jump into autofocus mode with close subject priority, which is something that looks familiar to those of us who've been shooting with the Z6, the Z7, the Z5, the Z50, all those cameras that were out before 3D autofocus tracking. In those cameras, the only mode besides the wide area modes or the area modes with the box that you're tracking things inside of was auto area, and you'd see all kinds of squares lighting up as it searched for a subject and did a pretty good job of it. Well, what I'm seeing in 3D tracking is that it's trying to stay as close to the subject you've pinpointed with your 3D tracking point as possible, but when it loses it, it's doing a little bit of automatic area searching with little boxes fluttering around that people aren't used to seeing, and then grabbing back onto the subject the instant that it can. People are really disconcerted when they're seeing their wide area, the hybrid focusing mode. And I'm going to show you some examples. I'm going to run a little reel of examples. The hybrid mode, the hybrid handoff mode that I originally advocated putting on your shutter. You put wide area autofocus on your shutter, and then your back button can convert that to a 3D tracking point. So you find a face or an eye with your shutter in the square. You can individually capture one person versus another person by highlighting only the eyes that are in the square that you've chosen, lock them, and then transfer that to a 3D tracking point that moves all over the frame. Or you're shooting birds in flight or race cars or players flying around the field fast in frame-filling action, and you want to be able to pick them up with something larger than that small 3D tracking point in the frame. The wide area lets you helps you find, say, a bird in flight as it's flying through the frame, and then convert that with a button press into 3D tracking. Since I advocated that, I've actually updated my settings, and I'm going to be doing a video. In the next 2 weeks, I'm doing videos on firmware 3.0 as well as settings and autofocus changes that I've made over the last year with the Z9. I've changed that to where I'm putting wide area on the back button and using a function button either on the lens or on the body to override that with 3D tracking, and then using another function button on the body to be able to flip between wide area on the back button and single point autofocus on the back button. And that enables me to also manually focus without changing the focus when I shoot with the shutter. It just gives me 4 modes without even picking my eye up out of the viewfinder. Man, I will show you how those work in the next 2 weeks. There'll be a whole video about the setup, an addendum to my 4-part setup video for the Z9, plus just an ATS video about how to use those controls. So look forward to that. For right now though, I want to show you why I think that with Firmware 3.0 and the 3D tracking updates, it's still just as good as it ever was, if not better, and you should definitely download Firmware 3.0, play around with it. Don't be disconcerted that you see some squares moving around. They may just indicate that you're using that hybrid handoff mode in a situation where it really isn't the optimal mode to be using. All right, so let's just do a quick demo off the back of the camera of how this hybrid autofocus, the hybrid handoff autofocus is working. So here's wide area to animal hybrid focus. You know, you see the eye in wide area, you lock it in wide area, flip the other button to 3D. It's working great in Firmware 3.0. As long as it sees that animal, that human, that vehicle, you know, in that wide area, you're able to say, I only want to see what's in this box, straight to 3D. You didn't even lock it in wide area. You just hit the 3D button once it sees that eye. Now locking in wide area, flip into 3D. The hybrid is working great, and the 3D tracking seems even enhanced to me. All right, so how about with people? Well, you jump in with people. Here's my daughter Pepper, sees the eye, we've locked it, transferred to 3D with the handoff, the hybrid handoff going from one focus button to the other. Here's Pike going from wide area to 3D, wide area to 3D. Torso, head, eye. Crazy, the 3D is working great, and the hybrid handoff seems to be really good. What about vehicles? You know, here's my family taking off to a Halloween party. I'm going into vehicle subject detection, wide area, lock my Subaru in wide area as they drive towards me, hand off to 3D with the second button press. Boom, it overrode, went to 3D tracking, tracking the vehicle just great. I don't see a problem with the hybrid handoff, whether it's from shutter to back button or back button to a function button. You know, now sometimes you need to go single point because the wide area doesn't see a subject. So here I've locked in single point. You can see I'm in single point autofocus. How about handing that locked subject off to 3D? Bam, now I'm locked into 3D. It seems just fine. Once it's detected that subject and has it pretty well locked, handing off to 3D seems not a problem at all. The problem is really when I think you're misusing the hybrid handoff method. You know, you've got no discernible subject that the camera recognizes, like this bird feeder. It's not a car, it's not an animal, so it's going automatically now. This is where things have maybe changed a little bit. And I think you saw that. It's flashing all those little squares around, and that's what people are freaking out about. Well, this really isn't the situation where you ought to be using the hybrid handoff, you know, going from wide area with no discernible subject, human, animal, vehicle, eye, face, head, torso, headlights. You know, this is a situation where you're better off either just straight up using 3D tracking and saying, this is my subject with the 3D tracking button, or single point, or manual focus. Not necessarily trying to use an auto subject detection mode and hand it off to 3D tracking to track that automatically detected subject all over the frame. This is a scene where the camera isn't discerning a lot of difference between these bushes in the background and this bird feeder and this hangar. And so what I'm seeing with this new firmware update is that instead of saying, well, let's try to find something in the box to lock, it's just going into close subject priority auto area autofocus, which would be familiar to anybody who's used to shooting with the Z30, the Z50, the ZFC, the Z6, Z7, or any variants of those, the Z5. That auto area autofocus mode, which was the smart mode, if it didn't detect a subject, went into this closest subject priority looking for a subject. Watch, it looks really familiar. It's gonna start flashing little squares around looking for that subject to lock on, and then it does. All right, well, that's just not what the hybrid handoff using two different focus modes are made for. Those really are made for those types of situations where you're picking up a fast moving subject like a bird in flight or a race car coming through the scene, or you're trying to discern one animal from another and say, I only want to see eyes of what's in this box or the head of what's in this box. If there were 3 kids running, I could identify Pike, my boy, in his Lego Ninjago Halloween outfit as the one that I want to track and hand it off to 3D tracking that goes all over the frame. Same thing with my kitty Gray Gray. You know, handing off. Well, it's working just fine. In fact, I find the 3D tracking is working even more incredibly at sticking with the subject, and it'll pick it up without even locking it in the wide area. You can just lock it straight to 3D as long as it sees that eye in the box. Or you can lock it in the wide area and transfer just by switching buttons that you're holding down. So it seems to me it's working as well, if not better, than it ever has. Okay, everybody, I hope this video helps out a little bit. Again, I felt concerned enough about all the emails and comments that I've been seeing that I dialed up David Archer, my good friend in South Carolina, who's by far the best wildlife photographer I've ever met. He has made amazing images, from his D500 and D850 to his D5 cameras before that, and loves the Z9. He and I ran a workshop in Costa Rica shooting thousands of frames of animals in the jungle. I had him run out with Firmware 3.0, and he was like, I like it. It's working great, to try to put David's genteel South Carolina accent on it. We talked about, I said, well, people are having problems when they don't have a subject detected in the wide area and try to hand it off to 3D. And he's like, why would you do that? Well, there you go, right? I mean, that's a time where it can't detect. You should flip to single point and force it where you want, or go to manual focus, or use another mode like straight 3D tracking in the bank A standard settings. So there you have it. I hope this video helps out a little bit. I want to reiterate, this week's video is going to be about all the different changes that come with Firmware 3.0 and how to take advantage of those. The week after, I'm going to do a full updated Nikon autofocus for the Z9 video where we talk about sort of using the back button combined with a lens function button combined with a function button to be able to access the hybrid mode from wide area to 3D tracking, or single point to 3D tracking and manual focus, all without affecting anything when you're shooting with the shutter button, so you can lock with the shutter. It's a pretty cool updated setup that a number of people that I admire have advocated, including Tom Hogan and others. If you don't read Tom Hogan's articles about Nikon and what's going on in the industry, you really should. He's a great resource. All right, so there you have it. I'll be back out on Thursday with a video about Firmware 3.0. I hope this dispels a few concerns people have about the upgrade.